These are the two Bigme Hibreak E-Ink phones, one with a color screen and the other one with a black and white display. And both aim to fully replace your smartphone to simplify your digital life and reduce eye strain in the process. Let's see if they can achieve that. Having the two options to choose from is great, and both are also surprisingly affordable with around 200 euros, excluding customs and taxes, which I'd say is fair when comparing it to the Boox Palma, which is around that same price point but is missing cellular connectivity. But what surprised me the most when taking them out of the box, which is actually empty besides the phone and the SIM card ejector, there's not even a cable in here, was the nice build quality and handling. They have pretty thick bezels around the screen, but the display size of 5.84 inches means that the Hibreak is still somewhat compact and doesn't feel nearly as bulky as the Boox Palma. It really lies incredibly well in the hand and is essentially the same size as my Galaxy S22 with a case. Same goes for the weight, with around 170 grams, which is again very similar to the Galaxy S22 without a case. So all in all, handling is really great and I love this form factor. Besides the volume rocker, there's also a power button directly above and a customizable button on the opposite side. They have this copper color accent, which looks nice, but is actually needed because the buttons don't protrude as much as on many other phones, and as a consequence can be a bit harder to find in the beginning. On first glance, the textured back side looks like it might be soft to the touch, but that's actually just plain old hard plastic. But honestly, I don't mind it, and it actually feels totally fine. Same goes for the rest. It's a plastic build that doesn't exactly feel high-end, but it's functional and the phones feel very solid. There is a camera on the front and on the back, and also an LED that you can use as a flashlight. What seems a bit strange at first is the audio setup, because around the frame there's no opening for a speaker, just a microphone here at the bottom. The earpiece is actually the only speaker on this device, which is definitely unusual. And that speaker unfortunately doesn't sound especially good neither for playing back music nor for phone calls. But since this isn't meant to be a multimedia machine, I can actually forgive that. And despite this being not a multimedia machine, the MediaTek Helio P35 chip and 6 GB of RAM offer a solid low to mid-range setup and are more than enough for anything most people typically do on an E-Ink screen. The Hibreak phones can get a bit warm with more intensive usage though. The internal storage has 128 gigs, of which around 103 gigs are usable. And if needed, you can also use a microSD card to expand that. All of the mentioned points are the same on both versions of the Hibreak. So let's talk about the biggest difference between the two: the displays. And let's start with my preferred choice, the black and white version. This one has a 275 ppi resolution, which is not as crisp as the 300 ppi we had for quite a while on most e-readers, but not far behind. Even in direct comparison, that's a difference that's really hard to spot. As it's typical with the black and white E-Ink screen, it's easily readable in direct sunlight and I never had issues during the day, outdoors or indoors. And you can also dial up the Frontlight to make it usable in complete darkness as well. The 55 nits maximum brightness is totally sufficient throughout the day, and when it's dark, you usually dial that down to the bare minimum. The lowest setting is dim enough to not cause blinding for most. There's no color temperature adjustment, and the Frontlight control can be a bit fiddly though, but I'll come to the software in a second. Let's first also have a look at the Hibreak color, and what immediately stands out with that one is the glossy screen. No idea why they shipped it this way, because I think that glossiness defeats the purpose of it being as easy on the eyes as possible. There are two screen protectors in here that significantly reduce the glossiness. But putting it on without air bubbles was not especially easy, and I actually had to throw the first one away because of it. But once it's on and you manage to do that without too much air trap, it's effective in reducing the reflections. As it's typical for color ink with an RGB filter, the screen of the Hibreak color is also darker compared to the black and white version. But with a color resolution of just 92 ppi, it's actually a bit brighter than the most recent EInk Letter 3 screens with 150 ppi though. However, that lower resolution is very noticeable when looking at any colored content. The hybrid color also has a Frontlight which gets much brighter with 135 nits maximum brightness, which helps bring out colors more. But make no mistake, compared to your typical LCD, they are still muted and much less saturated. Same as with any other RGB layered EInk device right now. Overall, I like having colors on here and it helps with some smaller issues like low contrast black and white content with running Android on EInk. But personally, I don't think it's worth the trade-off in this case. Not that it's an entirely bad experience, but the black and white version is more eye-friendly, cleaner and crisper with fewer trade-offs, especially when taking the glossy screen without the matte screen protector into account. But also in terms of battery life, which I'll talk about in a moment. When it comes to Frontlight quality, both are similar. There are halos visible at the bottom of the screen and also a brightness gradient from top to bottom, but because of the 2:1 aspect ratio, I didn't find either one to be an issue, to be honest. On the software side, I was positively surprised at how much better this actually felt compared to the user interface on the Bigme tablets. I mean, it's essentially the same thing with running Android 11, but it feels less cluttered and as a consequence also a bit easier to use. Android 11 will definitely raise some eyebrows as we're already moving towards Android 15. While that older Android version is obviously not ideal for future app compatibility, I doubt it will cause too many problems in the next few years because according to the compatibility distribution in Android Studio, it still has a market share of around 19%. However, what's more of an issue in my opinion is the Android security patch version. Android 11 will not receive any more security updates, but even so, the one installed on here is from January 2021. The last one Google released is from February 2024. So I'd like to see at least that one to get the best possible security for a device that is essentially constantly connected to the internet. Another potential issue is data privacy, as the Bigme Hibreak is connecting to Chinese servers quite a bit. So personally, I recommend using an app firewall if that bothers you. So let's have a look at the user interface and first talk about the things I don't like or found outright annoying. The one thing I regularly criticize Bigme for is still an issue with the Hibreak phones: missing polishing. Let's start with the control center, which for some reason is aligned to the right side of the screen. I suspect that's a leftover of Bigme shrinking the control center down from the tablets. I mean, it works, but it's not the greatest experience. Putting it side by side with the Boox Palma definitely shows that Boox put a bit more thought into implementing that one. Same goes for how the Hibreak models manage notifications, which they simply don't indicate with the usual icons in the notification area. So you need to pull down the notification tray to actually see what's in there. At least the lock screen shows the notifications, which helps to offset this problem a bit. So I guess it's fitting that the hybrid color just goes into standby when I get a text message, which is super annoying and for some reason doesn't happen with the black and white version. I'm also not a big fan of the fixed clock in the top left corner of the launcher, especially because that just leads to the date and time settings. Widgets can only be placed on a separate widget screen, and depending on the widget, they might work or not work with the white background. You can use a third-party launcher, but the phone just resets the default launcher at some random interval and switches back to the Bigme launcher. So right now, that's not a long-term solution if you'd like to use widgets. Another strange bit is the missing clock or alarm app on here, which is one of the most basic features any phone has, and it actually makes me think no one has used this phone as a daily driver during the testing period. Or everybody had dedicated alarms or smartwatches. Either way, you can fix that by installing the Google Clock from the Play Store, luckily. Okay, let's move on and talk about using Android on EInk. Android isn't actually meant to run on EInk, and even though there are a couple of things I wished Bigme changed, overall, it's actually not a bad experience once you work around the mentioned points. What I found incredibly handy is the custom button on the left side that you can bind the ink control center to, for example, and quickly open it to adjust the ink mode if an app doesn't run properly. It takes a short while of getting used to that, but you quickly adapt, and in the end, using Android on here works really well. What also helps is Bigme's proprietary anti-ghosting technology. Switching to the fast or extreme mode allows you to enable the auto clean settings that gets rid of ghosting. It's not perfect, but actually works incredibly well, and in some instances even better than the Boox Super Refresh technology. So you can even watch videos on here reasonably well if needed. The reason why you don't just keep that faster screen setting is that it also reduces image quality. So typically you want to run the device with the HD mode and only switch to one of the others if it's actually too slow. But with the faster modes, you often need to turn up contrast levels a bit to actually see everything on the screen. The cameras on both phones are identical with 5 megapixels on the front and 13 megapixels on the back. The quality is what you can expect from this price point. Good enough for quickly capturing something, but I wouldn't take my vacation pictures with it. Here are some impressions and also a few side-by-side comparisons with a Samsung Galaxy S22 to put it into perspective. If you expect weeks-long battery life, I have to disappoint you. To start, the battery drain wasn't consistent. When first using both phones, they were draining around 1% per hour for the black and white version and 2% per hour for the color version in standby mode, so not doing anything with the phones. After rebooting both and not using any apps before letting them rest again, the drain slowed to about half of what it was before. Still not great, but definitely better. Why the color version still drained the battery noticeably quicker when not doing anything, I don't know. But that has been consistent in my testing. When using the phones normally, I'd say you can expect runtimes of 48 to 96 hours with the black and white version and 24 to 48 hours with the color version. But in general, leaning more towards the lower end for either one. That was actually the biggest disappointment for me, to be honest. My Samsung Galaxy S22 lasts longer both in standby and with heavy use. And of course the hybrid phones can also last much shorter with heavy use. Another thing that could be better is reliability using them as phones. When I put my SIM cards in, both worked right away and I could make and receive calls with no issues. Establishing a connection when making a call tends to take a bit longer though. However, when moving to somewhere with poor reception, both hybrid models had reproducible issues with making and receiving calls, even though the phones showed 1 or 2 bars. At the same location with the same provider, my Galaxy S22 had no issues making a call. Same was true for WhatsApp and Signal messages and calls. Sometimes they came through without delay and without any issues, other times they didn't. A more pleasant experience was using the phones with Google Maps and the GPS connection, which worked fine despite the hybrid phones not having a built-in compass. So apart from its phone functionality, this can be an interesting outdoor solution with E-Ink, built-in mobile connectivity and GPS, because there aren't many devices with those technologies combined in one device. And the last thing I quickly want to mention is the missing SAR rating. At least I couldn't find any information on that, and the Bigme chat didn't reply to my question about it. I don't want to start a conversation about the potential dangers or lack thereof of RF radiation, as I honestly know too little about that to add anything meaningful, but if that's important to you, you now know. Which brings us to a conclusion, and I have to say I really wanted to like these phones. There are a couple of things on the user interface side that I don't agree with, but I could actually still live with. I also really like the handling and less bulky feel compared to the Boox Palma. I even could live with the battery life. But what broke the camel's back was the poor reliability when it comes to using them as phones. I need to be able to rely on my phone, and that's something that wasn't possible with the hybrid models. Granted, most of the time I had no issues as far as I can tell, but when moving to an area with somewhat poor reception, both phones were too unpredictable for me. However, what's noteworthy is Bigme's habit of releasing regular updates for their other devices, which often bring performance improvements. So I wouldn't be surprised if battery life and reception will improve in the future. If the mentioned issues are not a concern for you right now, or you're just looking for a small e-reader and not a phone, then I'd say the Hibreak models are worth checking out already. And they're also interesting as GPS-capable ink devices with mobile connectivity. Please like and subscribe if you found this review helpful, and also leave a comment if you'd like to see more e-ink phone or dumb phone reviews. Thanks for your time watching, and see you on the next one.